For this video, we're going to take a look at factoring polynomials by grouping. So remember, polynomials is just a fancy way of saying we have something with multiple terms. In this case, we have 4 different terms. When we factor by grouping, we are breaking it into its separate parts. So remember, that's when we can redistribute to check our answers. In order to factor by grouping, we have 4 different steps that we are always going to do. So the first step is to group the first 2 terms together and the last 2 terms together. So when we look at that, that means we're looking at the first 2 things together, and we're going to look at the second 2 things together. And it's going to be really important that we look at it 2 at a time. Once we group them together, we are going to factor out the GCF for the 2 things that we're looking at. So between x cubed and 7x squared, we want to figure out that GCF. Remember, a GCF can be a coefficient, or it can be a variable, and it can be a combination of the 2. In this case, we have x and we have x. Remember, when we have the same variable, we take the smaller of the exponents. So that's my x squared. I'm going to factor out x squared for these 2 terms. When I do x cubed divided by x squared, that leaves me with a single x. And when I do 7x squared divided by x squared, that leaves me with positive 7. So we just looked at the first 2 things together. Now we're going to do the same thing for the second 2. So we're going to look at those 2 together and figure out that GCF. For this, we have 2x and we have 14. They are both positive numbers, so I know I can factor out a positive 2. When I do 2x divided by 2, that leaves me with x. When I do 14 divided by 2, that leaves me with positive 7. When we do factor by grouping, our goal, we know we're doing it right if we get the same thing inside our parentheses. So we see that they both have an x plus 7. Since they have that in common, that is going to be one of our factors. That's one part of it being broken down. The other part comes from the GCF of both of our things. So we are going to take the x squared and the plus 2, and we're going to combine those together into their own set. So I have x squared plus 2, and that combines into its own set. That is our broken down version of our polynomial. So that's factoring by grouping. And then remember, we can always use FOIL, or we can redistribute in order to check our answer. So if we were to do that, we could have x squared plus 2 times x plus 7. Remember, x squared gets shared to both things, so x squared times x gives me x to the 3. X squared times 7 gives me plus 7x squared. Then I'm going to share the 2 to both things, so 2 times x gives me 2x, and 2 times 7 gives me 14. Remember, we know we're correct when our redistribution gets us the exact same problem, so we know our answer is right. We're going to do that same process with a couple of other problems. So let's take a look at number 1. Remember, we're looking at those first 2 things together and then the last 2 things together. So when we look at number 1, I am comparing 3x cubed plus 15x squared. When I do that, I want to find the GCF. I see that my coefficient can be 3. I can take a 3 out of both things. And then they both have an x. We take the smaller of the exponents between my 3 and my 2. The squared is the smaller exponent, so I can factor out 3x squared. When I do that, what's left on the inside? For the first term, when I do 3x cubed divided by 3x squared, that just leaves me with a single x. And then when I do 15x squared divided by 3x squared, that just leaves me with positive 5. So that was factoring a GCF out for the first 2 things. Now I need to do it again with the second 2 things. For the second 2, remember, our goal should be to get x plus 5 on the inside of our parentheses, just like we had the x plus 7 in common up top. In order to do that, I need to factor out a -2. That's what's going to get me this positive 5 in the middle. So I'm going to factor out -2. I also know that I can do negative because they both have the minus sign. And that's going to leave me with x plus 5. Now we got to break it down into its parts. So the thing that they have in common, the x plus 5, that becomes one part in our answer. And then the other part of our answer is the GCF for both things. So 3x squared minus 2. I'm going to combine them in their own parentheses and put it right next to my x plus 5. Remember, we can always check in order to redistribute. We're going to do number 2 now. Number 2, same process. We do have a little bit more variables to deal with, but we'll take it one step at a time. So we're going to look at the first two things together, my 8x squared and my 12x. Looking at my coefficient, I can factor out a 4. And then looking at those variables, I see that they both have an x. The smaller exponent is x to the first. So my GCF for the first part is 4x. When I factor that out, 8x squared divided by 4x gives me 2x, and 12x divided by 4x gives me positive 3. We're going to do the GCF for the second two things now. So between 2xy and 3y, I can't do a coefficient because there's no number I can divide 2 and 3 by that make them smaller. But they do both have a y in common. So in this case, my GCF is just positive y. When I factor that out, I get 2x for my first term, and I get plus 3 for the second term. Whatever they have in common, so in this case, my 2x plus 3's is one part of my answer. I just bring it down below. And then the second part of my answer is taking those GCFs and combining them into their own set of parentheses. And that's our factor by grouping. I went ahead and I did examples number 3 and 4 so you guys can see the work. Again, it's that same process as our first 3 problems. We're looking at the first 2 things, looking at the second 2 things. I do want to do 5 and 6, talking it through just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So for number 5, again, we're looking at our first 2 things. When I look at that, I have 6y squared minus 3y. The coefficient that I can factor out is a 3. And then for my variable, they both have y, so I can factor out y to the first, my smaller of my exponents. That leaves me with 2y minus 1 on the inside. So remember, when we're doing negative 3y divided by 3y, negative 3 divided by 3 gives us that negative 1, and then my y's cancel each other out. Then we're going to look at those second 2 things. When I look at that, I see that the only thing they have in common is a z. When I factor that out, I'm going to have positive z on the outside. Inside, I'm left with 2y. When I do negative z divided by z, remember we have those coefficients in the front. So the first thing is negative 1 divided by positive 1. That gives us negative 1. So yes, our z's cancel out, but we need to have that 1 there, so when we redistribute, we get that minus z back. Once we do that, we can take out our common thing, so our 2y minus 1, that's one part of our answer, and then the second part of our answer is those GCFs, so 3y plus z. Number 6, we have a couple more variables going on, and we have more exponents, so I want to make sure that we talk through that one as well. Looking at those first 2 things together, I see that there's no coefficient, but they do both have an x. Remember, if it's the same exponent, we don't have any decision to make, we can just take that out. So x squared is going to be my GCF. When I factor that out, that leaves me with a single y. Remember, my x squareds cancel each other out. And then on the second side, we have 3x squared divided by x squared, so that gives me positive 3. When I do the second two things, again, I see that I have a minus and a minus, so that tells me I'm going to be factoring out a negative something. Between 7 and 21, I can factor out a 7. And then with my y's, I have y squared and I have a single y. The smaller of the exponents is y to the first. When I get what's left over on the inside, negative 7 divided by negative 7 gives me positive 1. And then y squared divided by y, I'm subtracting those exponents and I get a single y, or 1y. Then on the other side, we have negative 21 divided by negative 7. That gives me positive 3, and my y's cancel each other out. I see that y plus 3 is the thing that they have in common, so that's going to be one part of my answer. And then that second part of the answer is the GCF, so x squared minus 7y. I went ahead and did 7 and 8 also, just to show you that. The one thing that I do want to point out to you guys is on number 8, when I am factoring out for the second set, I do want to make sure that I'm getting x plus 3. So in this case, for negative x and then minus 3, what I factor out is a negative 1. Sometimes it's just a negative that we need to factor out and there's nothing else. So that's normal, but again, we're trying to make the things on the inside match. So that's why we needed to factor out that negative. So all of that was factor by grouping. Again, we're just following those simple steps at the top, and we can always redistribute in order to check our answer. Remember, we have that built-in check to help us with this unit.